The ranch had been standing there long before anyone decided to draw neat boundary lines and call the surrounding land a community. Acres of open ground stretched under a wide sky, framed by old fencing, grazing animals, and a barn that had weathered decades of storms without asking permission from anyone. This land wasn't bought from a developer brochure or approved by a committee. It was inherited, expanded, and legally documented long before the idea of an HOA ever reached this area. The return to the ranch was meant to be quiet. After years away, the plan was simple: unlock the gate, walk the land, and reconnect with something that had never changed, even when everything else had. The gravel road leading up to the main entrance was familiar, every turn etched into memory. But as the truck slowed near the gate, something felt off. The gate was closed. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the new sign bolted onto it. Bright, official-looking, and aggressively worded, it claimed private community access, HOA enforcement, and trespass violations. It didn't belong there. The gate had never carried anything except a weathered, "No trespassing" sign placed decades ago, one that was still legally valid and clearly marked on county records. Before there was time to step out and inspect it, movement caught attention near the driveway. Two vehicles were parked nearby, clean and modern, the kind that screamed neighborhood authority rather than rural necessity. Standing near them was a woman dressed with deliberate sharpness, posture stiff, arms crossed, eyes locked onto the truck as if it had just committed a crime by existing. The ranch owner stepped out calmly, not expecting confrontation but already sensing it. The land beneath those boots was legally owned, surveyed, taxed, and protected by documentation thicker than any HOA rulebook. Still, the presence of someone so confident in their opposition made it clear this wouldn't be a peaceful homecoming. The woman moved closer, positioning herself between the gate and the driveway like a checkpoint. Her confidence didn't come from ownership or understanding. It came from perceived authority. The kind that grows unchecked when no one challenges it. She didn't ask questions. She didn't seek clarification. She acted as though the matter had already been decided. This was her territory now, and anyone crossing into it without her approval was a problem to be removed. From her perspective, the ranch was no longer what it had once been. In her mind, development had changed everything. Roads had been paved nearby. Homes had been built. A homeowners association had formed, complete with rules, bylaws, and enforcement power that she believed extended further than it actually did. Somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself that the ranch was just another unregistered property falling under her control. The reality was very different. County records still showed the ranch as independent land, excluded explicitly from any HOA jurisdiction. The HOA itself had been built around the property, not over it. Legal boundaries had been drawn carefully, but assumptions had replaced facts for those who never bothered to check. The ranch owner moved toward the gate, keys in hand, ready to unlock it and drive through as had been done countless times before. That was when the situation escalated without warning. A phone appeared in the woman's hand. She didn't hesitate. She didn't verify. She didn't reconsider. She made the call with absolute certainty that she was in the right. From her perspective, this was an intruder attempting to force entry into a restricted area. She framed the situation with dramatic urgency, confident that authority would arrive to back her up. The ranch owner stood there, watching the call unfold, not angry, not panicked, just quietly aware that this mistake would not end well for her. What she didn't know was that this land wasn't just owned. It was protected by layers of legal clarity. Easements, exclusions, historical land use documents, and recorded notices all painted a picture that directly contradicted her claims. And those documents weren't sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere far away. They were accessible, current, and enforceable. As the call ended, the woman's confidence visibly increased. She positioned herself more firmly, convinced that the arrival of law enforcement would validate her authority and remove the problem standing in front of her. The ranch owner leaned against the truck, patient. There was no need to argue. No need to explain. This situation had moved beyond personal confrontation. Now it was about facts versus assumptions. Around them, the ranch remained calm. Animals grazed undisturbed. Wind moved through tall grass. The land itself seemed indifferent to the drama unfolding on its edge, as if it had seen far worse than misplaced authority. Minutes passed. Then the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the quiet. The woman straightened, prepared to be proven right. What she didn't realize was that the next few minutes would unravel not just her confidence, but everything she believed her HOA controlled. And as the first patrol car pulled into view, the ranch owner knew that this encounter would mark the beginning of an outcome no one in that neighborhood was prepared for. The arrival of law enforcement shifted the energy immediately. What had felt like a personal confrontation now carried the weight of official process. The woman's posture grew more rigid, her confidence sharpening into something almost performative. From her perspective, this was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when authority would align with her assumptions and force the situation to resolve in her favor. The patrol vehicles rolled to a stop near the gate, tires crunching against gravel that had been part of the ranch long before the nearby community roads were paved. The officers stepped out calmly, their presence neutral, professional, and observant. They took in the scene without rushing to judgment: the locked gate, the posted signs, the vehicles, the land stretching far beyond what any small neighborhood could reasonably claim. The woman immediately positioned herself as the one in charge. Her body language suggested ownership, control, and certainty. She pointed toward the ranch owner and the gate, framing the situation as a clear-cut case of trespassing in defiance. In her version of events, this was HOA property, restricted access, and a violation serious enough to demand immediate removal. The ranch owner remained still, composed, and unbothered. There was no attempt to interrupt or correct her narrative midstream. Years of dealing with contracts, property lines, and legal realities had taught patience. This wasn't a moment to argue emotionally. This was a moment to let facts surface naturally. The officers listened carefully. They asked questions methodically, not taking sides, not reacting to tone or confidence. One of them glanced at the gate, noting the older signage beneath the newer HOA notice. Another looked past the woman toward the open land beyond, clearly recognizing that this wasn't a typical residential access point. When attention finally shifted to the ranch owner, the contrast was immediate. There was no raised voice, no defensive posture, no urgency to prove anything. Just a calm explanation that this was privately owned land, excluded from the HOA, and legally documented as such. That was the first crack in the woman's certainty. She dismissed the claim immediately, convinced that paperwork wouldn't matter against HOA authority. In her mind, rules were rules, and her position as HOA president gave her the final say. What she failed to understand was that HOA authority doesn't override county records, property deeds, or state law. The ranch owner retrieved a folder from the truck. Not hastily. Not dramatically. Just deliberately. Inside were copies of the property deed, boundary surveys, exclusion clauses, and recorded notices filed years before the HOA even existed. Each document told the same story: this ranch was never part of the association, never agreed to its rules, and was legally protected from exactly this kind of overreach. The officers reviewed the paperwork carefully. This wasn't their first encounter with HOA disputes, but the clarity of the documentation made this one stand out. Boundaries were clearly marked. Legal language was explicit. There was no ambiguity to exploit. As minutes passed, the dynamic shifted again. The woman's confidence began to erode. Her posture softened, her movements became restless, and her certainty gave way to irritation. She doubled down verbally, insisting that development plans, neighborhood growth, and HOA expansion somehow changed reality. But those arguments didn't hold weight against signed deeds and recorded exclusions. One officer stepped aside to verify the information through official channels. County databases don't lie, and they don't bend to neighborhood politics. The results came back quickly, confirming exactly what the ranch owner had said. The land was private. The gate was lawful. The HOA had no jurisdiction there. What followed was a quiet but decisive moment. The officers informed the woman that there was no trespassing taking place. Not only that, but the call itself bordered on misuse of emergency services. Her attempt to assert control had backfired, placing her actions under scrutiny instead of the ranch owners. For the first time since the confrontation began, silence fell over her. The authority she believed she commanded evaporated under the weight of reality. Her HOA title meant nothing here. Her assumptions carried no legal power. But the consequences didn't stop there. As the officers continued reviewing the situation, additional concerns surfaced. The HOA signage placed on the gate had not been authorized. The attempt to restrict access to private land constituted overreach. And worse, this wasn't an isolated incident. Records showed previous complaints, boundary disputes, and aggressive enforcement tactics associated with the same HOA. What had started as a single call began to unravel into something much larger. The ranch owner stood quietly as the scope expanded. This wasn't about revenge or satisfaction. It was about accountability. Years of unchecked authority had led this HOA to believe it could operate beyond its limits. Today, those limits were being clearly defined. The officers explained that the matter would be forwarded for further review. Not just regarding the false trespassing claim, but the HOA's broader conduct. Improper enforcement, misrepresentation of authority, and interference with private property were serious issues. The woman attempted to regain control, but the moment had passed. The narrative she had constructed collapsed under scrutiny. Her confidence turned defensive. Her authority dissolved into liability. As the officers prepared to leave, they made it clear that the ranch owner was free to access the property without obstruction. The gate could be opened. The signage could be removed. Any further interference would result in consequences. The ranch owner unlocked the gate slowly, deliberately, and drove through without another glance back. The land welcomed its owner home without resistance, just as it always had. Behind them, the woman stood frozen, watching her perceived empire crack at the foundation. What she didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. The paperwork had spoken, but now regulators, legal oversight, and county authorities were about to take a much closer look at her HOA. And when they did, the fallout would be swift, public, and irreversible. The days following the confrontation were quieter on the surface, but beneath that calm, pressure was building rapidly. What had begun as a single misguided attempt to assert control over land that was never part of the community had triggered a chain reaction no one in the HOA leadership had anticipated. Once county officials were notified, the situation moved out of neighborhood hands and into formal review. The ranch owner returned to the land as usual, continuing daily routines uninterrupted. The gate remained open when needed, the unauthorized signage removed without ceremony. There was no celebration, no sense of victory. The land had always belonged to its rightful owner, and now it simply functioned as it always had. But elsewhere, the fallout was accelerating. County offices began pulling records related to the homeowners association. Formation documents, boundary maps, and enforcement notices were reviewed line by line. What quickly became clear was that the HOA had been operating far beyond its legally defined limits. Properties that were never included in the original association had been targeted. Rules had been enforced selectively. Authority had been assumed, not granted. The ranch was not the exception. It was the clearest example. As regulators dug deeper, they found a pattern of intimidation disguised as governance. Homeowners had been fined without proper notice. Access had been restricted unlawfully. Threats of legal action had been used where no legal standing existed. Most residents had complied out of fear or confusion, never questioning whether the HOA actually had the power it claimed. The incident at the ranch changed that. Once the story reached the wider community, whispers turned into conversations, and conversations into formal complaints. Residents who had quietly endured years of overreach now had proof that the HOA leadership could be challenged, and defeated, with facts. The HOA president attempted damage control. Emergency meetings were scheduled. Notices were sent. Language was softened. But the shift was already underway. Trust had been broken, and authority exposed as fragile. Legal review soon followed. Attorneys representing multiple homeowners requested documentation the HOA couldn't properly provide. Financial records raised questions. Enforcement actions lacked consistent justification. And most critically, the association's jurisdiction had been misrepresented in official communications. That misrepresentation carried serious consequences. State law didn't leave much room for interpretation. An HOA that falsely claims authority, interferes with private property, and misuses enforcement mechanisms can be sanctioned, suspended, or dissolved. In this case, all three outcomes were on the table. The board members began resigning one by one. Some claimed ignorance. Others distanced themselves entirely. The president, once so confident at the ranch gate, found herself isolated, facing scrutiny without the shield of collective authority. Within weeks, the decision came down. The Homeowners Association was placed under formal review, its powers frozen pending investigation. Accounts were audited. Enforcement actions were voided. Fines were refunded. And then, with no viable path forward and multiple violations confirmed, the final step was taken. The HOA was legally dissolved. There was no dramatic announcement. No public spectacle. Just official notices filed, authority revoked, and a neighborhood quietly returning to individual ownership and responsibility. The organization that once overreached so boldly ceased to exist with a few signatures and stamps. For the ranch owner, life continued uninterrupted. The land remained unchanged, steady and indifferent to the rise and fall of artificial authority. Fences stood where they always had. The barn weathered another season. The open sky stretched endlessly overhead. The confrontation that started it all faded into memory, but its lesson remained clear. Power without legal grounding is an illusion. Confidence without documentation is fragile. And authority assumed without consent will always collapse under scrutiny. The woman who once blocked the gate lost more than her position. She lost credibility, trust, and the structure she relied on to exert control. Her actions had not protected the community. They had exposed its weaknesses. The ranch, meanwhile, stood as quiet proof that ownership, when backed by law, needs no approval. Sometimes, all it takes to dismantle an empire built on assumption is one locked gate, one phone call, and one person who knows exactly what they own.